We're going to be hearing the story of Padmasambhava. And kind of like what Kustasara was evoking, like stories have an effect on us. Stories kind of influence us and influence the way we see things and the way we live. And Buddhism talks in all sorts of different ways. It talks in concepts, it talks in ideas and frameworks, but it also talks in images, myths, symbols and stories. And stories touch us on a level that ideas and concepts just can't. So when we're hearing these stories, just do your best to just be open to them, enjoy them. They're such wonderful stories, these Buddhist stories, especially these Padmasambhava parts of his life. So just enjoy them and let them affect you in whatever way they do. So yeah, just a bit about how Padmasambhava fits into Buddhism as well. So Buddhism started with the Buddha, so Shakyamuni Buddha, who lived 2,500 years ago. But then since then, his teachings were passed down through individuals. So there were individuals practicing throughout time, from the time of the Buddha down to us now. And one of those people was Padmasambhava. He was one of those individuals that Buddhism was passed down through person to person, and then Padmasambhava lived around 700 to 800 AD. So it's around 700... I can't do the maths off the top of my head. It was 700 AD, which is sometime after the Buddha lived. You can do the maths. I was thinking about Jesus, but it's like, no, the Buddha wasn't in zero anyway. Yeah, so he was around 700 to 800 AD. And he was a Tibetan master, basically. He was a Tibetan Buddhist tantric master. But he was originally from medieval India, so he was born in India, and he taught Buddhism to Tibet. And we'll hear more about that next week. But we've got accounts of his life. So we've got accounts of Padmasambhava's life, and they're semi-historical, semi-mythical. We don't really know what parts are historical, what parts are mythical, but there's elements of his life that are very magical, and they're very kind of like out there. And we're not being asked to take these literally. We're not being asked to say that they're not true, but just they're mythic, so they have symbolic truth to our lives and our minds. So just take them as mythical, historical. And yeah, so he's one of the most influential figures in Tibetan Buddhism, but also, as Moch Kumara said, in our tradition. So he's a very important figure in our tradition as well, in the Triratna tradition. So we reflect on and talk about Padmasambhava quite a lot. So last week we heard about his birth. So Akasha Mitra gave a talk on his birth. So if you wanted a more full account of that, you can listen back on YouTube. But we heard about his birth. So according to the myth, he was miraculously born on a lotus in the middle of a lake. So there's this lake Dharmakosha, and there was a lotus in the middle of this lake, and it opened up, and Padmasambhava was born in the middle of this lotus on the lake. And at the time, there was a king called King Indrabhuti, and he was the ruler of Udayana. So there's a place, Udayana, and he was the ruler of this place, and he was a wise ruler, he was a compassionate ruler. So on all accounts, he was a very good man, and he wanted an heir. So he wanted an heir that he could pass on the kingdom to. And he longed for a child that he could pass down the kingdom to. But he was never managed to have one. He never managed to conceive a child. But one day he had a vision. So he wanted this child. He wasn't able to, but he had this vision. And the vision told him, go down to Lake Dharmakosha. So go down to Lake Dharmakosha. So he went to the lake. And when he got to the lake, he saw this wide lake with this amazing lotus in the middle, with this radiant child seated in the middle of the lotus. So it's like emanating brilliant light, kind of like glorious, beautiful child. And when he recognized the extraordinary nature of this child, he took him in and adopted him. So he saw this child as a divine gift, a gift that had been given to him from the beyond, and he adopted him as his own to become his heir. So that's where our story tonight begins, where Padmasambhava has been adopted by King Indrabhuti, and he's taken back to the palace by the king, and he's kind of empowered as the crown prince. So he's now become the prince. He couldn't have an heir by himself, but he's taken this child and he's made him the crown prince. And his arrival brought great prosperity to the land. So the land was struggling, but when Padmasambhava came, there was great prosperity. So it became fertile, it became rich, and a peaceful land. So basically everything was good in the land. So it had a wise ruler, a kind ruler, and he now had this heir that he'd been longing for, which brought great prosperity, fertile land, riches. So everything was as it should be. And yeah, Padmasambhava was given all of the luxuries you'd expect that a prince would get. So he was given a really good life. So he came off this lake, he came straight into the palace and was given this really good life. But just the life of the prince just didn't work for him. He grew up quickly. He was very mature for his age. He was gifted. He was talented, but he was also restless. He couldn't be contained by this life, this palace life. He just had a restlessness that was bigger than he could have in this world that he was brought into. And he used to go on these long solitary walks. So he'd go on walks by himself. So I think he was probably around like 10 at this time. He was quite a thoughtful man, like walking around, having his thoughts. And when he was going around, he had a vision of a Buddha. So this probably around 10-year-old, he had a vision of a Buddha. And the Buddha told him, it is time to leave the kingdom. So he had a vision of this Buddha saying, it's time to go. You can't stay here anymore. You need to leave the kingdom. And the king tried his best to make Padmasambhava stay. He could see that Padmasambhava was restless. He could see that it wasn't working for him, but he really tried the best to make him a home that he could be in, a home that he'd want to stay in. But the problem was that Padmasambhava wasn't from this world. In the myth, Padmasambhava came down. He was an emanation of a Buddha, and he was born on this lake. So he was always a stranger. He'd always be a stranger to the kingdom. He was a found child from another realm who was brought into the kingdom, and he'd never fit in. So in a way, you could say that Padmasambhava was in the world, but he wasn't of the world. He was of something more. He was of the realm of the Dharma. That's where he'd emanated from. And so he couldn't be held down by the princely life. He couldn't be contained. He couldn't be defined by the things that his adopted father, was trying to make of him. And so the kingdom was just never going to be enough. So he had this vision that said, you need to leave. He had this restlessness that he couldn't be here. So he knew that something needed to change. And he knew that something drastic needed to happen. So he knew that he needed to leave the kingdom. He'd been told he needed to leave the kingdom. He felt, I can't be here. He said, I need to be gone. But I can't just be gone. I need to be irrecoverably gone. There needs to be no chance of me coming back. I need to get away from here with no chance of me returning. And then this is when Padmasambhava starts to get a bit weird. So hold on to your hats. So the first thing he did was he started to dress very unusually for an Indian prince. So he walked around naked, except for an animal skin across him. So there was this beautiful prince all of a sudden walking around naked, but for this animal skin. And he also wore a garland of severed heads. So he had a garland of severed heads around him. And in one hand he held a vajra, you can kind of see it on there, but it's kind of this shape. I won't talk that much. There's more said about it last week, but there's the vajra is kind of this shape, and it's a symbol for reality. It's a symbol for the indestructible nature of reality. And then he also held a trident in the other hand. So there's this prince walking around naked, covered in animal skin, holding a vajra and a trident, and he let his hair grow long and wild. So there's this kind of feral-looking prince suddenly walking around the kingdom. And yeah, it didn't say what his father thought, but you can kind of imagine what his father thought. And then he climbed on top of the palace. So he climbed to the top of the palace and he started to sing and dance and chant. So there's this wild prince with his hair down, his eyes wide, dancing, singing and chanting at the top of the palace. And then a crowd gathered. You can imagine, this is pretty unusual. I was thinking, imagine Prince William doing this on top of Buckingham Palace. People would come and look, wouldn't they? They'd come and have a look. So a crowd formed a crowd formed underneath in the courtyard underneath the palace to see what was happening, and they looked up at this wild prince singing, dancing, completely feral, completely wild, hair down, Vajra in one hand, trident in the other, looking at this sight. But then something happened. The Vajra fell down. So the Vajra fell down from the top of the palace and hit this small Brahmin boy on the head and killed him. So this Brahmin boy was hit by the Vajra and killed. But not only this, he dropped the trident as well, and the trident fell down and killed his mother. So we've got a Vajra falling down and killing a boy, and a trident falling down and killing his mother. And the dance was over. He was on top of the palace. It was silence. Everyone was stunned. What's happened? There's this prince, and now these people have died. And this was followed by uproar. People were shocked. People were outraged. And the boy's father, so he's a Brahmin boy, so it's kind of like a religious caste. And his father was one of the king's most important ministers. So he had Padmasambhava seized and jailed. And people wanted him dead. People wanted Padmasambhava put to death. They said, no, this is not acceptable. He needs to be put to death. But the king was in this position where he loved his son. He loved his son, this adopted child who he brought in. He loved him, but everyone was demanding that he put to death. So he needed to find a compromise. So what he said was, Padmasambhava will be banished. He'll be banished from the land, and he'll be sent to a cremation ground where he'll live in exile. So he's exiled to a cremation ground with no chance of returning for purification and penance for what he'd done. So yeah, Padmasambhava was sent to the cremation ground, and he got what he wanted. He was gone. He was irrecoverably gone. There was no way he was coming back for this. But then there, in the cremation ground, he was free. He was finally free to express his spiritual vision and live the spiritual life that he wanted to live. Yeah, so it's important to say now that we're not to take this story literally. I don't want people going home being like, oh, I thought Buddhism was nice, and then suddenly they told me to kill people. So this is, it's entirely symbolic. This is not a basis for action, it's entirely symbolic, and there's a rich symbolism to this story, but it's not to be taken literally. And I just want to say now that Buddhism is categorically against killing people. It's categorically against harm. So the first precept in Buddhism is against taking life. It's against causing harm. So we're not to take this literally. We're not to take this as instruction of how to be free. So it's just a symbol, and I'll unpack the symbolism of this. But just to put that out there now, as draw a line in the sand. So the killing of the Brahmin boy and his mother is quite shocking. When you hear it, it's quite shocking. And then the exile as well, as this prince who's exiled into a cremation ground. It's all quite shocking. But these are symbols, and they can be read in lots of different ways. So I'll unpack the different ways that we could read into these. So the first thing to mention is that the boy that was killed was a Brahmin boy, and this is the highest caste in the Hindu system. So it's kind of like in the Hindu system, people are delegated different social roles. In the Brahmin caste, it's their duty to do the religious work for the society, basically. And Brahmins in Buddhism, so Buddhism was very critical of the caste system. Buddhism was very against the caste system, and it was often, in Buddhism, Brahmins are often used as a symbol for religious orthodoxy and religious convention. So this kind of rigid, orthodox, institutionalized religion, society and culture. So for all the religious things in culture that kind of ossify, lose their spiritual vitality, and are hemmed in by their rules rather than the spirit of things. So that's often what Brahmins represent in Buddhism. So the death of this Brahmin boy represents, it's the killing within Padmasambhava of any sense of institutionalization or orthodoxy or rigidness around religion. So within all of us, there's the potential for that. And within Padmasambhava, there was the potential for that. But this image of him, the boy dying, that's within Padmasambhava, this religious orthodoxy, or being hemmed in by the rules of religion, being completely teared out or completely destroyed within him. And I think for us, we don't live in a society as much where we're at risk of that. We live in a fairly unreligious society now, so we wouldn't have the same pressures. At the time of Padmasambhava and at the time of the Buddha, there would be a lot, like society would be a lot more religious, so there'd be more risk of this religious institutionalization. But I think there is something to learn from this within us. So when we first encounter Buddhism, we can quite quickly take on ideas about what we think a good Buddhist should be and what a good Buddhist should do. And in a way, that's not a bad thing, because as we're still learning, we're trying to figure out, like, okay, what would the Buddhist thing be here to do? So if I'm in this situation, what is the Buddhist thing to do? What would the Buddha recommend to do? So in a way, it's not so bad taking on this idea of trying to do what the Buddha says, but it won't be sustainable forever, basically. There'll become a point where we need to move beyond just trying to be a good Buddhist, and we'll need to find a deeper motivation and understand the teachings on a much deeper level, where we can really understand them in our life and in our experience. That's more than just having an idea of what we should be, but a real feeling for the Dharma, a feeling for what we should do, a feeling for what the Dharmic response would be. So it's kind of this killing of the institutionalized or orthodox religion. It's not getting rid of those things, but it's just letting them come from a deeper place within us, where we're really feeling it for ourselves. We have a feeling for the Dharma that then expresses itself in our life. So that's a way that we could look at the killing of religious orthodoxy within ourselves. But it's also a symbol for going beyond societal convention. So I think this is much more a risk that we'll be under, is there's certain conventions and expectations in our society that we feel pressured by, and they're implicit, but they're explicit, but they're also implicit. We can kind of soak them up without realizing, as well as having people expressing their expectations of us. And to live a spiritual life, we can't blindly go along with these. We can't blindly go along with the conventions. We need to be willing to go against it if we need to. If we can feel that actually my inner wisdom or what I'm being drawn to do in my spiritual life is actually going against what these other people think I should be doing, we need to be willing to follow that. We need to be willing to subvert it or even go against it. And that also leads to accepting that it may lead to disapproval as well. You can see in Padmasambhava's life story, it's kind of the extreme of disapproval. He was exiled, he was banished. There was uproar wanting to kill him. So that's kind of the most exaggerated or the most hyperbole form of disapproval. But living a spiritual life, it does go against the grain, and it may lead to disapproval from the people around us. So, for example, at work, if you're prioritizing working on your mind over ambition and career and success, other people might disapprove of that. They might, especially if they can see that you're changing, they might disapprove, kind of like, oh, you're not working as hard as you used to. But actually, it's like your priorities are changing, so there may be disapproval there. Or it might be that as truthful communication becomes more important to you, there'll be times where we have to stand up to people that are trying to not tell the truth, people that are trying to help us kind of collude with them or kind of tell lies to protect us or to protect them. But we need to be willing to stand up to that and tell the truth, and that may lead to disapproval from those people. Or it might be going vegetarian as well. So when we go vegetarian, that may lead to disapproval from people that we know. We might have friends that aren't vegetarian, and they might feel threatened, or they might feel like you're criticizing them, and then you might get disapproval there. So there's all of these different aspects where we may end up getting disapproval for trying to live a spiritual life. Yeah, so there's another aspect is the Brahmin boy we could talk about representing, he would be what Padmasambhava would become if he'd played it safe. So he was given this wonderful life, he was given this opportunity to just live the life of a prince. And it would have been a very good life. It would have been a life of like luxury, he would have been well looked after, he would have been well fed, he'd have probably had a lot of entertainment. And if he'd played it safe, then he would have been able to carry on living that life. And that's kind of what this other boy represents. He represents playing it safe. And one of the great dangers in our lives is by playing it safe, basically. If we play our lives safe and don't take the risks, we're going to sell ourselves short of what we could be, or sell ourselves short of our potential. And it's vital that in our spiritual life, we don't sell ourselves short as well, because we can easily have a view that, oh, that's kind of, I can do a bit, but I can't go the whole way. Or, oh yeah, other people will be able to will be able to spiritually advance, or they'll get somewhere, but I won't. I can do a bit, but I'm not going to. But it's important that we don't sell ourselves short with that either. We need to have faith that we can change, and we can move more than we can imagine. We can change more than we can imagine. And yeah, another aspect that we could think about it is basically a symbol for growing up. So we've got the boy and his mother, and that's kind of the strongest symbol we could have for childhood. A boy and his mother, it's like a symbol for childhood. And you could see this as an image for growing up. It's an image for moving beyond childhood. And it's one way that we could see the spiritual life. It's one way we could see practicing the Dharma is just growing up. Because in relation to the Buddha, in relation to the enlightened mind, we're basically children. We're basically children, as opposed to the enlightened mind that's much wiser, can see much more clearly, has much more experience. So in one way, you could see the spiritual life as a path of growing up. And yeah, the last thing I want to say is the dance that he does. He's on the top of the palace doing this dance. He's wild, he's free. And this basically symbolizes us breaking out and being completely free. So we all have a yearning to be free. All of us, at some part of us, there's just there's a feeling of, oh, I need to be more free than this. I feel contained. I want to be more free, but also wanting to be authentic. So we have this desire to be authentic, and so much of our lives can be wrapped up in inauthenticity. So we can do things because we think other people will approve of them, or we might do things we don't like because we need to earn money, or we say things that we don't mean because we want to avoid disagreements. So there's all of these different areas where we can be inauthentic. But there's this yearning in us, there's this desire to be authentic, to be truly authentic. And the thing is, this authenticity will be destructive. This authenticity will be destructive to inauthenticity. All of these parts of our lives that we're not being authentic in, if we're really authentic to ourselves, if we really follow our deepest desires, if we listen to our deeper wisdom, it will be destructive to all of these different areas where we're not actually being authentic. And it may feel destructive, it might feel really destructive, but it's important that we do so that we can live more and more authentically. I had this image come to me in meditation. Now I don't know if it's going to work, but it came to me, so I'm just going to try it. Who here's heard of Miley Cyrus? Yeah, okay. So this was kind of like a mundane example of what I think was going on here. So for those of you that don't know, Miley Cyrus was this kind of like child star who early on in her life, she was in this show called Hannah Montana, which was this kind of Disney show about her being a pop star, basically. And so she was this young girl, and she was brought into this life of being this child star, this child pop star. And yeah, she did quite, like, the show did well from what I gather. And she was in it for a while. But inevitably she grew up. Miley Cyrus grew up, and I don't know what was going on in her mind, but I'm kind of interpreting what happened, was that Miley Cyrus grew up to a point where she was like, oh, I can't be Hannah Montana anymore. I'm not going to, that doesn't fit anymore, that doesn't work. If I'm going to keep growing up, I can't be shackled to Hannah Montana. And then then Miley Cyrus went through this weird phase where she, I'm not going to go through all of it, but there's this like music video of her naked, like swinging on a wrecking ball, smashing up this building. And then there was also her doing some inappropriate dancing on some television show and something like that. But you can kind of see here that it was like she'd been born into this life. She was given this life that was too small for her as she got bigger, as she was more grown up. She couldn't keep doing that anymore. So she had to do something drastic. She had to do something to change the way that people were seeing her, change the way that she saw herself. And she had to do all these kind of strange and reckless things to break free. And you can kind of see now, like, she's still really famous, but you don't associate her with Hannah Montana. So in a way that worked, like it was good. Although it's strange. And you see with Padmasambhava, kind of that arc is there as well. But that's what we need to do with our lives, is we'll have built this. So that's kind of like an external example. But internally, we need to do this. This is what we need to be doing all of the time. We'll have built this identity. We'll have built this self at some point in our life, kind of without realizing it. And we'll get to a point where we grow beyond it. We'll be bigger than it. But it will still be our life. It will still be the way that we see ourselves, and it will still be the way that other people see us. And if we're in touch with what's going on with ourselves, we will feel cramped by it. We'll feel trapped by it, and we'll want to break free. And we'll need to do things that shake it. We'll need to do things that shake up the status quo in a way, shake up our image of ourselves, shake up other people's image of ourselves, so that we can break free beyond it, so that we can keep on growing. So it's kind of, this is what this part of the story is telling us. We need to be breaking free of the restrictions that we've put on ourselves, from the restrictions that society and other people have put onto us, so that we can carry on growing. I was thinking about a time in my life where I feel like this happened. And when I came along to the Buddhist Center, I was running a video production company. So I was kind of like running a business with a friend. And it was going quite well. Like, we had people so we did music videos and stuff like that, and we had people that worked with us regularly, and I was kind of like well known in a certain circle for doing that, and it was kind of, that was my identity basically. That was who I was. I was this guy that was running this video company, and kind of I don't know quite how to say this, but the way that I got my gratification was I'd introduce myself and they'd be like, oh, what do you do? And I'd be like, oh, I run a video production company. And everyone would always be like, oh, cool. And it would always be like, oh, yeah, okay. It's cool. And then I came along to Buddhism, and I started changing, basically. I started practicing Buddhism, I started meditating, I started looking at my ethics, I started seeing my mind more clearly, and I started changing. And then that life that I built for myself, that identity that I built for myself, it became restricting, and it became painful, and it got to a point where when I introduced myself and I was like, oh, I do video production, and people were like, oh, cool. I had the opposite reaction. I was just like, oh, God, not again. And it was like, that actually became painful. So that identity that I built, it was based on how I wanted to look to other people, largely. Like, there was enjoyment in it, but there was so much of it was built around what I wanted to look like. And the more authentic I was becoming, the more painful that got. And then I was coming to the Buddhist Center, and I was going into the small shrine room to do a meditation, and I saw a poster. It was a 4.5 month retreat at Adhisthana, which is one of our retreat centers. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I went into the meditation. We did probably about a half an hour sit. And by the end of that sit, I knew that I had to do that retreat. It was just something within me had gone, I need to do that retreat. And it's kind of, when Padmasambhava was out for his walk, and I'm not saying it was exactly this, but it's kind of when Padmasambhava was out for his walk, and then the Buddha came down and said, you need to leave the kingdom. It's as if that was my point, where something within me or outside of me or whatever had said, no, you need to leave this kingdom. You need to do something different. You need to go and do that retreat. And in a way, the decision was made at that point. There was nothing I could do about it. It was just that was what I was going to do. But then I was faced with this quandary of, okay, but I have this life. So I lived with the person I ran the business with. I lived with my partner at the time. I had this life. I had people that looked to me. I was like fairly well known. I had a sense of identity. But then I had this strong knowledge that I needed to go and do something completely different. And all of these things I've talked about. So there was this like fear of disapproval. I knew I'd upset the person I worked with. I knew I'd upset my partner because we were living together and I wanted to go away. I so there's conventions. So it's kind of like, it isn't what people do. When people start a business, they keep going and they keep doing it until it improves and they get more successful. There was like a path laid out for me. I was choosing to do something different. And also just I knew that people wouldn't understand. It's kind of like everyone knew me as this person that was running a video production company, doing music videos. And all of a sudden I was going to say, oh, I'm leaving, I'm going to go do a Buddhist retreat. And I knew people wouldn't understand. But there was this deeper authenticity, whatever you want to call it, that was saying, no, you have to go and do this. And if I'm honest, it did feel extremely destructive. I remember I was meditating one day in the lead up to this, and I literally had an image of me smashing up a house around me. It was that I felt like I was smashing up everything around me. And it was painful and it was difficult, but I knew that that was what I needed to do. And it was like that authenticity, it was destructive to the inauthentic parts of my life that I'd built, but I had to do it. And I did do it, and it was difficult. But looking back, it was definitely the best decision I've ever made. It was like that was a big reorientation in my life, and it was definitely the best thing that I've done in terms of living a more authentic life. And yeah, so these things, that's kind of like a concrete example in my life, but we do need to be listening to I don't really know what words to say, but it's kind of like a deeper wisdom or like an authenticity that is actually telling you something more true, more authentic, and we need to follow that. Yeah, I guess I've been talking quite a while. I'll pause there just in case there's any questions about what I've said so far. Yeah.
What do you feel now that when people ask you what you do and your response on that?
I don't know, I'm in a different situation now. I'm a primary school teacher at the moment, and when I tell people I'm a primary school teacher, they're like, oh, cute. And I'm like, not quite. So, I don't know, it's a different response. So I guess that's not, I guess in terms of the Dharma life I'm living, I feel like I'm much more, I just feel like I'm living much more actually who I am, and so it doesn't really matter so much what other people think. Quite often when, especially at work, if I talk about my Buddhist life with my non-Buddhist friends, they definitely don't get it. And there's kind of this like awkward like shuffle or kind of like, oh, okay. And I don't mind. It's kind of like I'm living authentically. I'm living more authentically now. So, yeah.
Did any of the parts of your life that you left, did they transform or did you leave them all behind?
I think there's been, don't want to make this all about me, but like it's kind of like yeah. I guess the parts that I had to let go of have been finding a way back in, but in a like more pure or a less impure way or something. Kind of like, I think there was so I had to not do video for a while. Like I just literally couldn't touch a camera. I was just like, oh. But then I had an experience a year ago where I did filming on a retreat, and it was just really simple for me, and it was like I needed that space. Yeah. Any Dharma questions? No, nothing wrong with those questions. I just don't want to make it my. Yeah.
Sangadari.
Oh no.
The lover is killed by a trident, and the boy is killed by the Vajra. Why is that?
Don't know.
So they're like the different implements. Just wondering why those two.
Well, the trident, Padmasambhava's trident, is sometimes said to be the, without going too much into it, he had a female consort later in his life, and it's said that she could turn into a trident, so she'd be with him at all times. So you could say that the trident's an emanation, embodiment of the feminine, and the Vajra's a implement of the masculine, and they went to each one. But I don't know. I've never thought about it. Yeah, you can let me know.
Yeah.
You reflect and let me know. Yeah. Okay, great. So we'll move on to the next part of the story. Okay, so Padmasambhava's been exiled, and he's left, and he's now dwelling in cremation grounds. So he's far away from towns and villages. These cremation grounds, they're far away from anywhere where people would want to go. And they're lonely places. And they're basically places where once people have died, they're taken there and they're either left to rot or they're set fire and then their remains will be there. So they're not places where you particularly want to go. And so he was there. He was exiled to this cremation ground and he was surrounded by bodies or pieces of bone, basically. So this really horrible setting, and they're strange places, these places are said to be. And they're the dwelling places of hyenas and vultures, kind of like the darker creatures. And they're also haunted by strange ghosts, gods and goddesses, ghouls and vampires. They're like all of these creatures dwell there. And it's also the abode of the Darkini. So the Darkini are female deities or demons or ogresses. They're bright red and they're fierce, they're wrathful, but they're also beautiful. And they fly through the air completely unobstructed. And they're adorned with skulls, they're adorned with bones. They carry staffs and daggers. Some have human heads, but some have animal heads as well. And they drink blood out of skull cups. So this is the place where Padmasambhava is now. And he's left the safe society, he's left a safe culture, and he wears the garments of a yogi, a meditating person. He takes a skull cup, and he's sat up against a stupa. Now we've got some stupas here, and these are kind of like burial mounds in the time of the Buddha. And he's flushed red with ecstasy. So he's sat here meditating in the cremation ground, these bodies around him. And these Darkinis, these red deities or demons are dancing around him, and he's teaching them the Dharma. So this is the image that we leave Padmasambhava on. He's been exiled and he's now in the cremation ground meditating, surrounded by death, with these Darkinis dancing around him, flying in the air, completely unobstructed. So yeah, everything Padmasambhava's doing, safe assured, is thoroughly disreputable. He's kind of blown it in terms of people approving of him. And you just kind of imagine if there was a man who in the local graveyard kind of hung around meditating and not wearing many clothes, we definitely want nothing to do with him. It's easy when you hear these stories to be like, oh yeah. But actually if we encountered it, it would be really disreputable. It would be really strange. But again, the cremation ground symbolises something deeper. And this is an image of Padmasambhava's inner experience. But what does the cremation ground symbolise? So in the broader sense, the cremation ground is a symbol for all the places we'd rather not go. So the kingdom is the safe place. The kingdom is the place we feel safe, it's familiar, it's comfortable. But the cremation ground is the unknown. It's the things we're scared of. It's the things we'd rather not look at. So Padmasambhava symbolises the aspect of enlightenment of transformation. He's concerned with transformation of the depths. So we all have these energies in our unconscious depths that are trapped, that are locked up. But we need these energies. We need these deeper energies if we're going to live a spiritual life. And he represents the transformation of these deeper energies. And him in the cremation ground symbolises confronting our fears. So the most primal fear that we have is the fear of death. So that's kind of like as a living being, the most primal fear we have is the fear of death. And it's one of the things that we spend all of our life trying to avoid in one way or another. We try to avoid the reality of it. We try to avoid thinking about it. And so much of our energy is locked up in trying to protect ourselves from being harmed, and therefore dying, basically. And that can be our image of ourselves dying, or it can be our physical form dying. Yeah, we try to avoid this fact, and the fact is that we will die. We will die, and also everything in our life will come to an end. Everyone we know will die. All the things around us will come to an end. And in the cremation ground, Padmasambhava is surrounded by this fact. It's everywhere. He's not turning away from it. He's dwelling within it. He's facing it directly. He's surrounded by death. And in Buddhism, we are encouraged to reflect on death. We're encouraged to bring the fact of death to mind. And this isn't meant to be done in a morbid way. It's not meant to be done in a way that will induce depression and just being down and glum. It's meant to be in the context of the Metta-bhavana, like we were doing earlier, in the context of emotional positivity. And in the context of that, with a calm and concentrated mind, we can bring death to mind. We can bring reflections on death to mind. And rather than having a negative effect on us, they can have a freeing effect on us. They can have a liberating effect on us. So there's three basic reflections that are encouraged within Buddhism to do with death. So one is the inevitability of death. So basically that death is a fact of life that we can't get around. If there is life, there is death. If there is a rising, there's passing. If there is a beginning, there is an ending. And so death is interwoven with life, so it's inevitable. There's nothing we can do to get around it. It can't be cheated or beaten. And we need to live informed by this truth. Again, this isn't meant to make us scared. It's meant to help us to live in a way that's informed by that fact. So what's the most meaningful way I can spend my time if I know that I'm going to die? If I know that my time is going to come to an end, what's the most meaningful way I can spend my time here now? So that's what this reflection's meant to bring out in us. The next one is that the time of death is uncertain. So nobody knows when they'll die. Nobody knows when anyone else will die. So it could come at any moment in any way. There's all sorts of ways. And we could reflect, like, so as you're doing anything, we could reflect, do I want this to be my last action? Do I want this to be the last thing that I say? Do I want this to be my last thought? All the things, sorry, that makes sense. Are there things that we want to do or repair? So there are things in our life that maybe we'd want to repair if we knew that this was going to be our last moment. And if we're bringing this to mind, we'll go more towards those things and we'll repair those things. And again, this is meant to encourage living well and living deeply. It's not meant to make us fearful or panicky. And also, at the time of death, the only thing that we have is the state of our mind that we've cultivated. At the moment of death, nothing we've gained in our life, all of our money, all of our success, all of our wealth, all of our status, none of that will help us. What matters is the mind that we've cultivated in our lives. As we're in those last moments of life, maybe we'll be in pain, maybe there may be some fear, but if we've spent our life cultivating love, cultivating courage, cultivating a clear conscience, we'll go into those moments much more positively. And so at the end, that's all we've got. None of the other things we do can help us. It's only the state of our mind. Yeah, and it also symbolises, so the cremation ground also symbolises the parts of our mind we'd rather not see, the parts of our mind we'd rather not look at. So we can often be blind to the parts of ourselves that don't fit in with our self-view. So we may have a view of ourselves that then blocks us to seeing the parts of ourselves that don't fit with that image. So when I came along to the LBC, I'd been meditating for a little while. So I kind of had a view of myself as a meditator. I was like, oh yeah, I'm a meditator. So I had this view that I was like, oh, I'm just this happy, calm, kind of like chilled out guy. That's just who I am. And then so I came along to the Buddhist Centre, and then practicing the Dharma, I started to encounter more of myself. But because I had this view that I was just this happy, chilled out guy, it meant that it was harder to see the parts of myself that didn't line up with that. So actually it made it harder to see that actually I get anxious quite a lot. It makes it harder to see that, oh, I do get angry. It makes it harder to see, oh, I do actually feel ill will towards someone. It's like if you have this view that, yeah, I'm just this nice person, it blocks you off to these other parts of yourself. But we need to be getting in touch with all of the different aspects of ourselves, even the bits we'd rather not see. So it might also be that we've learnt that some emotions are bad. It might be that there's someone in our life that got angry a lot and it was quite destructive. So we've learned, oh no, anger's bad, I can't do that. Or it might be that every time we expressed a certain emotion that we were told off, or we were told that that was bad. So we've learned to shrink that. So there's all these different reasons why we might have turned away from the different aspects of our mind. But there are also emotions that are just not very flattering. There are emotions that we just know if other people knew about them, they wouldn't be like, oh yeah, great, keep doing that. So I've got a little list, I won't go forever. But so one is spite. So it's basically doing something just to harm someone else. There's like no reason, just, oh, I just want to harm them. So there's spite. And there's resentment, also not very sexy, like holding a grudge for a really long time and just not being able to let it go. Like you wouldn't want to tell someone, oh yeah, I've just resented that person for 20 years. Envy, really not very flattering. It's kind of like, oh, something's really good happened for that person and I just don't like it, I want it. It's like we don't often admit that to other people or ourselves really. There's conceit, which I think is basically the view of like, I know everyone thinks they're special, but I actually am special. And we wouldn't often say that to people, but that is what all of us are thinking all the time, really, on some level. And then, yeah, the last one I thought is just like obsessive lust. So it's just lust that's just demonic, basically, that you just wouldn't want other people to see. And yeah, all of these unacknowledged emotions lead to energy being trapped. And if we're not aware of them, if we're not in control of them, or at least acknowledging them, then they control us. We can't act in response to it if we're not aware of it. And it also means that they come out sideways. So if we think, oh, I'm just not an angry person, I just don't get angry, what's probably happening is it's coming out sideways and everyone else can see that you're angry except you. So it's important that we need to be acknowledging all of these different parts of ourselves and not blocking them off and not trying to turn away from them. And when we've acknowledged them, when we're in touch with them, then we can transform these energies and we can put them to better use. Yeah, I'll stop there for a second for if there's any questions, and I'll wrap up. Yeah.
I guess sometimes like you have certain emotions that you feel, I don't know, you might, if you felt them since you were young, you might feel like they are very ugly, I guess. So, you mentioned like the word having control over them, but yeah, just thoughts on approaching them.
Yeah, I think that wasn't the right thing to say, having control over them. I don't think it's not so much that we have control over them, it's more that we have more control over our response to them. So rather than them leading us and rather than them being the driving force, we can experience them, know that we're there, but then respond more creatively than if we're just being led by them. I think that's more what I meant. Not that we're going to be able to control our emotions, but just that we can have a bigger perspective so that we can act wisely in response to those emotions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, we'll carry on. So Padmasambhava actually went to the cremation ground. So he went into these cremation grounds, but we need to think about how do we go into the cremation grounds. So we could go to India, we could go and find some cremation grounds, we could go sit in them, meditate in them, maybe some dark needs would emerge. Or maybe we could try going to Tower Hamlets Cemetery, see if anything happened there. But really, what we need to do to find our cremation grounds is we need to find situations where we confront our deepest fears. Situations where we're really brought up against ourselves, brought up against our limits, where we have no choice but to grow, no choice but to get bigger to be able to handle the situations. The Sangharakshita said that the cremation ground is the crucial situation deliberately sought out. So he said the crucial situation deliberately sought out. So it's a situation where we spiritually grow towards Buddhahood, where we spiritually grow towards enlightenment because there's no other choice. We're in this situation. All we can do is get bigger to confront the situation. So some examples. So it might be that one of the biggest fears for people is to stand up and talk in front of other people. That's like, statistically, that's like one of the biggest fears beyond loads of others. So it might be that. It might be that's putting yourself on show in front of people, standing up and being seen and saying things in front of other people. That might be a crucial situation where we need to rise to the situation. It might be emotionally opening up towards others. So it might be sharing our fears, sharing our thoughts, being willing for those parts of ourselves to be seen and be in dialogue, because that can be a great fear for people, is just that being in more intimate emotional connection with people. It might be speaking the truth, even if we know that we'll be criticised for it or that people won't agree with it, but speaking the truth regardless. For some people, it might be sitting in silence. It might be sitting down with no distractions and just seeing what the mind does when there's silence, when there's no distractions. It might be going on a longer retreat. So when we're on retreat, we'll be meditating a lot more and we can encounter parts of our mind that we haven't seen before. And these might be very blissful, but they might also be a bit scary. So we need to be in these situations so we can see all these different parts of our mind. And it might also be taking up a responsibility that involves serving others. So taking on a responsibility that you need to grow into so that you can help other people. So there's all of these different examples that maybe might be a crucial situation. But we need to reflect on what our crucial situations are. What are the situations in our lives where we're leaving the safety of the known, where we're going beyond the familiar, where we're going beyond the safe, to put ourselves in situations where we need to transform. We have no choice but to grow. So yeah, Padmasambhava was sat there in the cremation ground. He was surrounded by Darkinis, all dancing their glorious dance. And they represent energy and inspiration that's been unleashed, that's been released. All of these energies we're talking about that are trapped, they represent the complete freedom of these energies, the complete harnessing of these energies. And they're now with us, they're serving us, they're helping us. And that's what this image is of Padmasambhava sat underneath the stupa with all of these Darkinis dancing around him, all of these energies unleashed, completely released, completely with him, helping him move towards enlightenment. So we need these energies if we're going to live a spiritual life. We need these energies on board, these deeper unconscious energies, to bring them into the light. We need to break free of convention. We need to risk disapproval of others. We need to stop playing it safe, and we need to leave the comfort of the familiar, and we need to start growing up spiritually. And we need to turn towards the places we'd rather not see. So we need to face the facts of life. We need to face the facts of death. We need to look at the parts of our mind that we haven't acknowledged, that we don't want to acknowledge, the parts of our mind that we want to turn away from. And we need to find these crucial situations where we're forced to grow. So these situations where we're forced to transform, to become big enough to confront these situations. And then with all of these energies unlocked, and then with all of these energies unleashed, we'll be full of love, we'll be full of creativity, we'd be full of inspiration. And it's at that point then that we could be truly free. So yeah, I'll leave that there. Thank you. Okay, great. So yeah, really nice to be here with you. And then we'll be concluding the series on Padmasambhava next week with Maitri Kumara giving us the final talk on Padmasambhava's life. So yeah, do come back. The London Buddhist Centre is run. I'm sure lots of you know, but the London Buddhist Centre is run on donations. So it's run by people. So like all of the team here, all of the teachers, and all of the people that help support the class are all volunteers. We're just here because we want to be here, and we think that sharing the Dharma is just the best thing we could do. So everyone gives their time freely, and the classes are given freely as well, so that anyone who wants to can come. So price isn't an obstacle for anyone, but it does rely on donations. So please, on the way out, there will be a bowl. So please do consider giving a donation for the class. But also, if you can't, you're also completely welcome to keep coming back. Hopefully see you again next week, and have a good evening journey home.
Thank you.